They believed their fortress was impenetrable. 350 fighters circling like mechanical vultures, radar stations scanning every corner of the sky, flak batteries positioned to turn the heavens into a storm of deadly metal. The Third Reich had transformed this single industrial complex into the most heavily defended target in all of Europe. Yet, when the morning mist cleared on that October day in 1943, twisted wreckage littered the ground where once stood Germany's most crucial ball-bearing factories. How did a secret order turn what should have been a suicide mission into the single most devastating blow to the Nazi war machine that Hitler never saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air filled with the screams of tortured metal as Messerschmitt engines dove through smoke-filled skies. Pilots who had ruled European airspace for years found themselves overwhelmed by tactics they had never encountered, fighting a battle they could not win. In less than 4 hours, the Luftwaffe lost more aircraft in a single engagement than in any other day of the war. Factory floors that had hummed with the precision of German engineering lay silent under mountains of debris. Workers who had believed themselves safe behind walls of fighters and flak guns were pulled from rubble that buried the heart of Nazi industrial might. It was supposed to be impossible. Every military strategist knew that deep penetration raids into the Reich's industrial core meant certain annihilation for the attacking force. The mathematics of war made it clear. Bomber formations attempting such distances would be torn apart by successive waves of interceptors long before reaching their targets. German High Command had calculated every variable, positioned every defense, trained every pilot. They had built a shield of steel and fire that no enemy could penetrate. But calculations had not accounted for a secret directive born in the quiet corridors of Allied intelligence. A plan so audacious that even seasoned commanders questioned its sanity. A mission that would demand sacrifices beyond imagination and innovations that defied conventional wisdom. The order bore no signature, carried no official seal. Yet it would reshape the course of the war in ways that echoes through history even today. The autumn of 1943 found the Third Reich at the height of its industrial power. Yet cracks were beginning to show in the Nazi war machine. Across occupied Europe, factories worked around the clock to supply Wehrmacht divisions that stretched from the Atlantic Wall to the gates of Stalingrad. Yet no industrial complex held more importance than the cluster of buildings nestled in the Bavarian countryside near Schweinfurt. Here, in facilities that hummed with mechanical precision, German engineers produced the tiny spheres of hardened steel that kept every tank rolling, every aircraft flying, every submarine diving. Ball bearings seemed insignificant compared to the massive guns, armor plating, and engines that dominated wartime production. Yet Allied intelligence had identified them as the Reich's most critical vulnerability. Every rotating shaft in every German machine depended on these precise spheres of steel. Without them, panzer divisions would grind to a halt, Messerschmitt fighters would never leave the ground, and U-boats would become metal coffins beneath the waves. The factories at Schweinfurt produced 60% of Germany's ball-bearing supply, making them perhaps the most strategically vital target in all of occupied Europe. German High Command understood this vulnerability all too well. Over months of careful preparation, they had transformed the region into what military analysts called Fortress Schweinfurt. 350 of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots patrolled the skies in the latest Messerschmitt Bf-190G and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. Radar stations positioned throughout Bavaria provided early warning of any approaching threat. Below, more than 200 flak batteries ringed the industrial complex, their crews drilled to perfection in the art of turning Allied bombers into falling debris. The defenses operated in carefully coordinated layers, Long-range radar would detect incoming formations while they were still hundreds of miles away, allowing fighter squadrons to scramble and position themselves for maximum effect. As bombers approached German airspace, the first wave of interceptors would strike at the formation's periphery, picking off stragglers and forcing the remainder into defensive patterns that slowed their progress and exposed them to follow-up attacks. Successive waves of fighters would then tear into the weakened formations, exploiting gaps created by earlier attacks and preventing the bombers from maintaining the tight defensive boxes that provided their only protection against single-engine fighters. By the time any surviving aircraft reached the target area, flak batteries would unleash a barrage so intense that the sky itself would become a killing field of exploding steel and shrapnel. The system had proven devastatingly effective. Previous Allied attempts to strike deep into German territory had resulted in catastrophic losses that forced suspension of daylight bombing campaigns. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, refined through years of combat experience, seemed to provide an answer to every Allied innovation. German pilots, many of them veterans with dozens of aerial victories, possessed skills honed by constant combat and equipment that represented the pinnacle of German engineering achievement. Squadron leaders like Hauptmann Klaus Mietus and Major Egon Mayer had developed techniques that turned bomber formations into death traps. They would position their fighters above and ahead of the approaching formations, then dive in coordinated attacks that concentrated maximum firepower on specific sections of the bomber stream. The 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns of the German fighters could shred Allied bombers with devastating efficiency, while the superior speed and climb rate of the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs allowed them to escape before the bomber gunners could respond effectively. Yet across the English Channel, in the quiet halls of Allied command, a different calculation was taking shape. Air Marshal Arthur Harris of Royal Air Force Bomber Command had long advocated for area bombing campaigns that would break German civilian morale through the systematic destruction of cities. His American counterpart, General Carl Spaatz of the United States Strategic Air Forces, believed instead in precision attacks against specific industrial targets that would cripple the Nazi war machine through surgical strikes against its most vital components. The debate between these competing philosophies had raged for months in planning sessions that grew increasingly heated as the war dragged on. Harris argued that his night bombing campaigns against German cities were already showing results, forcing the Reich to divert resources to air defense and fire suppression while undermining civilian support for continued resistance. Spaatz countered that precision daylight attacks against carefully selected targets could achieve strategic victory more efficiently and with fewer civilian casualties. The deadlock might have continued indefinitely, but for the intervention of a quiet intelligence officer whose analysis would change everything. Colonel Marcus Thornfield had spent months studying German industrial production reports, captured documents, and intelligence gathered from resistance networks across occupied Europe. His conclusion was stark and undeniable. The destruction of Schweinfurt's ball bearing factories would paralyze German war production more effectively than the bombing of a dozen cities. Thornfield's report laid out the mathematics of industrial warfare with clinical precision. German tank production required specific grades of ball bearings manufactured only at Schweinfurt. Aircraft engines depended on bearings produced nowhere else in the Reich. Even small
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Arms production would slow to a crawl without the specialized components that only these factories could provide. The elimination of this single target would cascade through every aspect of German military capability within weeks. Yet the same analysis made clear the enormous cost of such an attack. Schweinfurt lay 400 miles from Allied bases in England, requiring bomber formations to fly through the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Intelligence estimates suggested that at least 70% of any attacking force would be destroyed before reaching the target, with the remainder facing almost certain annihilation on the return journey. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Success would require sacrificing hundreds of aircraft and thousands of airmen for the destruction of a few factory buildings. Traditional military thinking would have classified such a mission as impossible. The losses would be so severe that they would cripple Allied bombing capabilities for months, allowing German production to recover and defenses to strengthen. Yet Thornfield saw possibilities that others missed. His analysis had identified patterns in German fighter deployment, timing windows when defenses were reduced, and tactical innovations that might allow bombers to survive what conventional wisdom deemed unsurvivable. The key lay in understanding the limitations of the German defensive system. For all its apparent strength, Fortress Schweinfurt depended on predictability. Luftwaffe fighters were positioned to intercept formations approaching from expected directions at anticipated altitudes and speeds. Radar stations were optimized to detect large formations flying direct routes from known Allied bases. Flak batteries were sited to defend against attacks following established bombing patterns. Innovation could exploit these assumptions. If Allied formations approached from unexpected directions, German fighters would be out of position during the crucial initial moments of contact. If bombers flew at altitudes and speeds that differed from established patterns, radar operators might dismiss them as weather phenomena or friendly aircraft until too late. If the attacking formations abandoned conventional tactics in favor of approaches that confused and overwhelmed defensive coordinators, the entire system might collapse under its own complexity. Thornfield spent weeks developing what would become known as the Thunderclap Protocol, though the official designation would remain classified for decades after the war. The plan called for multiple diversionary raids that would draw German fighters away from Schweinfurt, while the main attacking force approached along a route that avoided major radar installations. Timing would be crucial, with all elements coordinating to achieve maximum surprise and minimum exposure to defensive fire. The protocol required innovations in navigation, communication, and tactical formation that pushed Allied capabilities to their absolute limits. Bomber crews would need to fly longer distances at lower altitudes than ever before attempted, navigating by landmarks rather than radio beacons to avoid detection. Fighter escorts would need to coordinate with precision timing while operating at the extreme limits of their range. Even weather conditions would need to be perfect, providing cloud cover for the approach while clearing enough for accurate bombing. When Thornfield presented his proposal to the combined chiefs of staff, the room fell silent as senior commanders absorbed the audacity of what he was suggesting. The plan would require the largest daylight bombing mission ever attempted, with formations approaching from multiple directions to overwhelm German defenses through sheer complexity. Success would depend on split-second timing, flawless coordination, and the level of tactical innovation that had never been attempted in combat. General Spaatz studied the proposal for long minutes before speaking. The losses would indeed be catastrophic if the mission failed, potentially setting back Allied bombing campaigns by months. Yet the potential rewards were equally enormous. The destruction of Schweinfurt could shorten the war by years and save countless lives that would otherwise be lost in prolonged fighting. The mathematics of sacrifice suddenly took on different meaning when calculated against the possibility of strategic victory. Air Marshal Harris remained skeptical, arguing that the plan relied too heavily on untested innovations and assumptions about German defensive capabilities. His night bombing campaigns were producing measurable results through steady attrition of German industrial capacity and civilian morale. Why risk everything on a single desperate gamble when proven methods were already achieving success? Yet even Harris could not deny the elegance of Thornfield's analysis. If the mission succeeded, it would demonstrate that precision daylight bombing could achieve strategic objectives more efficiently than area attacks against cities. If it failed, the losses would force a return to night bombing campaigns that Harris favored. Either outcome would resolve the strategic debate that had paralyzed Allied bombing efforts for months. The final decision came from the highest levels of Allied command, delivered through channels so secret that no written record would survive the war. The mission would proceed, but under conditions that protected both planners and participants from the consequences of failure. If Thunderclap succeeded, it would be hailed as a triumph of Allied innovation and determination. If it failed, all records would be sealed and the disaster attributed to routine operational losses during normal bombing missions. Colonel Thornfield received orders to begin immediate implementation of his protocol, with resources and personnel drawn from across Allied bomber commands. The mission would launch within 6 weeks, timed to exploit seasonal weather patterns and German defensive rotations that intelligence had identified. Every aspect of the operation would be compartmentalized, with individual units receiving only the information necessary for their specific roles. Training began immediately at bases scattered across England and Scotland, with aircrews practicing low-level navigation techniques and formation flying that differed radically from standard bombing procedures. Fighter pilots rehearsed extended-range missions that would push their aircraft to the absolute limits of fuel capacity. Ground crews worked around the clock to modify aircraft for missions that demanded performance beyond original design specifications. The preparations took on an almost supernatural intensity as October approached. Aircrews knew they were training for something extraordinary, though security restrictions prevented them from understanding the full scope of what they would face. Equipment modifications were made in secret, with specialized components installed under the supervision of technicians who had signed oaths of silence. Navigation aids were recalibrated for routes that appeared on no official maps. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German intelligence began detecting signs of unusual Allied activity. Radio intercepts suggested increased training exercises, though the specific purpose remained unclear. Reconnaissance flights reported modifications being made to Allied aircraft, though the nature of these changes could not be determined. Fortress Schweinfurt remained at full alert, its defenses ready for any conventional attack that Allied forces might attempt. Neither side fully understood what was coming. The Germans expected another routine bombing attempt that their proven defensive systems would repel with acceptable losses. The Allies were preparing for a mission that would either reshape the war or destroy their strategic bombing capability entirely. In the quiet hours before dawn on October 14, 1943, both expectations would be shattered by events that exceeded everyone's imagination. The transformation had begun months earlier in workshops and hangars across England, where American and British engineers worked side by side to solve problems that no military manual had ever addressed. The challenge was simple to state, but enormously complex to solve. How could heavily loaded bombers penetrate hundreds of miles into the most heavily defended airspace in the world and return with enough aircraft intact to justify the mission? Traditional bomber formations relied on massed defensive firepower to protect themselves from fighter attack. Flying in tight combat boxes, the aircraft could concentrate their machine gun fire to create overlapping fields of protection that made single fighter attacks extremely costly for the attacking pilots. Yet these same formations were predictable in their routes and vulnerable to coordinated attacks by large numbers of fighters operating under centralized control. The innovation that would make Thunderclap possible came from an unlikely source, a young mathematician named Sarah Chen, who had been assigned to analyze German fighter tactics for the Office of Strategic Services. Chen's background in statistical analysis led her to approach aerial combat as a problem in probability theory rather than tactics, examining thousands of combat reports to identify patterns that human observers had missed. Her analysis revealed crucial weaknesses in German defensive doctrine. Luftwaffe fighters operated most effectively against large, predictable formations that approached targets along established routes at standard altitudes. The German system was optimized to vector fighters toward these formations with maximum efficiency, concentrating overwhelming force at decisive moments. Yet this same system became confused and ineffective when faced with multiple small formations approaching from different directions at varying altitudes and speeds. Chen's mathematics suggested that a properly coordinated attack using numerous small formations would overwhelm German defensive coordination through sheer complexity. Fighter controllers accustomed to managing intercepts against single large formations would struggle to coordinate responses to dozens of simultaneous threats. Radar operators trained to track predictable bomber streams would lose contact with formations that changed altitude and course unpredictably. The concept required complete abandonment of established bombing doctrine. Instead of flying in large, defensible formations, bombers would operate in small groups that could navigate independently to the target area. Fighter escort would be provided by formations that could engage German interceptors while remaining flexible enough to respond to changing tactical situations. Navigation would rely on visual landmarks rather than radio beacons, making the formations invisible to German direction-finding equipment until they reached the target area. Implementation proved enormously challenging. Bomber crews accustomed to flying in large formations had to learn entirely new techniques for small group coordination. Pilots needed to master low-level navigation skills that had never been required for high-altitude strategic missions. Radio procedures had to be completely rewritten to support operations that demanded radio silence for hundreds of miles. The most complex challenge involved timing. For the attack to succeed, dozens of small formations would need to arrive over the target area within minutes of each other, despite having flown different routes from multiple departure points. Weather delays, navigation errors, or mechanical problems that affected individual formations could disrupt the entire mission timing and leave isolated units vulnerable to concentrated German response. Flight Lieutenant William Morrison of the Royal Air Force found himself assigned to develop the navigation procedures that would make such coordination possible. Morrison had spent years flying night reconnaissance missions over occupied Europe, developing an almost supernatural ability to find targets using only visual landmarks and dead reckoning calculations. His task was to create navigation plans that would allow bomber crews with far less experience to achieve similar accuracy
under combat conditions. Morrison's solution involved intensive pre-mission training using detailed scale models of the terrain between England and Schweinfurt. Crews spent hours memorizing every distinctive landmark along their assigned routes, learning to recognize rivers, forests, towns, and industrial installations from altitudes and angles that would allow navigation without revealing their positions to German observers. The training was exhausting and demanded levels of precision that pushed many crew members beyond their previous capabilities. Fighter escort presented equally complex challenges. Standard escort procedures called for fighters to remain close to bomber formations, providing immediate protection against attacking interceptors. Yet Thunderclap required escort fighters to operate independently, engaging German fighters while allowing bomber formations to proceed to their targets without becoming entangled in aerial combat that would reveal their positions and intentions. Major Robert Sterling of the United States Army Air Forces received responsibility for developing the fighter tactics that would make this possible. Sterling had cut his teeth in combat over North Africa, where fuel shortages and maintenance problems had forced American fighters to operate with minimal support and maximum independence. His experience with improvised tactics and resource management made him the ideal choice for a mission that would push fighter capabilities beyond all previous limits. Sterling's approach involved creating what he called hunting packs of 4 to 6 fighters that would operate along the bomber routes, seeking out German interceptors before they could organize attacks against the approaching formations. The hunting packs would communicate through coded radio signals that would allow coordination without revealing the locations or intentions of the main bomber force. Success would depend on aggressive tactics that disrupted German defensive coordination while conserving fuel and ammunition for the return journey. The technical modifications required for the mission pushed Allied aircraft beyond their original design limitations. Bombers needed additional fuel capacity for the extended range requirements, yet the extra weight reduced their defensive armament and made them more vulnerable to fighter attack. Fighters needed auxiliary fuel tanks that increased their range but also made them less maneuverable during combat. Every modification involved compromises that reduced capability in some areas while enhancing it in others. Chief Master Sergeant Michael Rodriguez supervised the mechanical modifications at bases across England, working 18-hour days to ensure that hundreds of aircraft would be ready for the mission deadline. Rodriguez had learned his trade maintaining aircraft in the harsh conditions of the Aleutian Islands, where mechanical failure meant death in some of the world's most unforgiving weather.
His experience with improvised repairs and field modifications proved invaluable for a mission that demanded performance levels never contemplated by aircraft manufacturers. The modifications extended beyond simple mechanical changes to include electronic systems that had never been tested under combat conditions. New radio equipment allowed formation commanders to maintain contact across greater distances while remaining undetectable to German monitoring stations. Radar warning receivers provided early warning of German fighter approach without revealing the bomber's own positions. Navigation aids allowed precise course corrections without reference to ground-based radio beacons that German forces could monitor. Perhaps most crucially, the mission required development of new bombing techniques that could achieve the precision necessary to destroy the specific buildings that housed Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production. Traditional high-altitude bombing had proven insufficiently accurate against small industrial targets, often missing entirely or causing only peripheral damage that could be quickly repaired.
Thunderclap would require bombing accuracy that exceeded anything previously achieved in combat conditions. The solution came from techniques developed by Captain Jennifer Walsh, a former civilian pilot who had joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots program before being recruited for specialized bombing research. Walsh had spent months analyzing the aerodynamics of bomb delivery, developing mathematical models that could predict bomb trajectories with unprecedented precision. Her calculations revealed that accuracy could be dramatically improved through specific combinations of altitude, airspeed, and release timing that differed significantly from standard bombing procedures. Walsh's techniques required bombardiers to make split-second calculations based on visual observations of wind conditions, target movement, and aircraft performance. The mental demands were enormous, requiring levels of concentration and mathematical ability that exceeded normal bombardier training. Yet practice sessions using mock targets in the English countryside demonstrated that properly trained bombardiers could achieve accuracy levels that would make pinpoint destruction of specific buildings possible. As October approached, the pace of preparation intensified beyond anything previously seen in Allied bombing operations. Air crews flew multiple practice missions each day, rehearsing procedures until they became automatic responses that could be executed under the stress of combat. Ground crews worked around the clock to maintain aircraft that were being pushed far beyond normal operational limits. Intelligence officers updated target information daily, incorporating reconnaissance photographs and agent reports that revealed changes in German defensive dispositions. The security surrounding the operation became so intense that participating personnel were effectively isolated from all outside contact. Mail was censored, telephone calls monitored, and leave canceled indefinitely. The psychological pressure of preparing for a mission whose details could not be discussed with anyone outside the immediate planning circle took its toll on men and women who understood they were preparing for something unprecedented. Weather forecasters studied atmospheric conditions across Western Europe with intensity that bordered on obsession. The mission would require specific combinations of cloud cover, wind patterns, and visibility that occurred infrequently during autumn weather patterns. A single miscalculation could scatter the formations during their approach or prevent accurate bombing once they reached the target area. German intelligence, meanwhile, continued to detect signs of unusual Allied activity without understanding their significance. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights reported increased training activity at Allied bases, but the specific nature of the preparations remained unclear. Radio intercepts suggested operational planning on a scale larger than normal, yet the target and timing could not be determined. Fortress Schweinfurt remained at maximum alert, its defenses ready for any attack that Allied forces might attempt. Neither side fully comprehended what was about to unfold. The Germans expected another conventional bombing attempt that their proven defensive systems would defeat with acceptable losses. The Allies were preparing for a mission that would either revolutionize strategic bombing or destroy their capability to continue daylight operations over Europe. In the pre-dawn hours of October 14, 1943, both sets of expectations would be transformed by events that would reshape aerial warfare forever. The final briefings took place in Nissen huts scattered across England, their corrugated metal walls providing inadequate protection against the October chill that seemed to penetrate everything. Inside these improvised meeting spaces, aircrew members gathered around intelligence officers who would finally reveal the target that had consumed months of preparation and training.
The atmosphere was electric with tension, as men who had flown dozens of missions together realized they were about to undertake something entirely different from anything in their previous experience. Colonel James Harrison, mission commander for the American contingent, stood before maps that showed routes stretching deep into the heart of Germany. His weathered face reflected years of combat experience that had taught him to recognize missions that pushed beyond acceptable risk into realms where survival depended as much on luck as skill. Yet the strategic importance of Schweinfurt made such risks not only acceptable but necessary. Harrison's voice was steady as he outlined the mission parameters, but his eyes revealed the weight of responsibility he carried. 315 bombers would participate in the attack, approaching the target area along 5 different routes that would converge over Schweinfurt within a 15-minute window. Fighter escort would be provided by 240 aircraft operating in hunting packs, designed to disrupt German defensive coordination rather than provide traditional close protection. The complexity of the operation meant that individual formations would operate with unprecedented independence, making navigation and timing decisions based on local conditions rather than centralized control. Radio silence would be maintained throughout most of the mission, preventing German direction-finding equipment from tracking the approaching formations, but also eliminating the possibility of coordinated responses to changing tactical situations. Squadron leader David McLeod briefed the RAF contingent with characteristic British understatement, describing the mission as rather more ambitious than our usual efforts, while outlining procedures that would challenge every aspect of their training and experience. McLeod had survived 2 years of night bombing operations over Germany, experiences that had taught him the value of careful preparation and flexible thinking under pressure. His calm demeanor provided reassurance to air crews who understood they were about to attempt something that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. The intelligence briefings revealed the full scope of German defensive preparations around Schweinfurt. 350 fighters were positioned at airfields throughout Bavaria, with additional squadrons available for rapid reinforcement from other regions. Radar stations provided overlapping coverage that could track formations from the moment they crossed the German border. Flak batteries ringed the target area with firepower density that exceeded even Berlin's defenses. Yet intelligence had also identified the weaknesses that made Thunderclap feasible. German fighter deployments were optimized for intercepting large formations approaching along predictable routes. Radar operators were trained to prioritize tracking of major formations while filtering out smaller contacts that might represent weather phenomena or friendly aircraft. The defensive coordination system, for all its apparent strength, depended on centralized control that could be overwhelmed by sufficient complexity. Weather reports provided cautious optimism that conditions would support the mission requirements. High clouds would provide concealment during the approach phase, while breaks in the cloud cover over the target area would allow visual bombing. Wind patterns would be favorable for accurate bomb delivery, though unexpected changes could scatter formations or prevent proper coordination between attacking elements. The personal equipment briefings took on special significance, as aircrew members received gear that reflected the unique demands of the mission. Extended-range fuel tanks for fighter pilots came with warnings about reduced maneuverability and increased vulnerability during combat. Bomber crews received additional navigation equipment and emergency supplies for the possibility of forced landings in German territory. Survival kits included specialized items for evading capture in areas where Allied forces could not be expected to provide prompt assistance.
Intelligence networks could provide limited assistance. Flight Sergeant Thomas Wilson, a navigator with 37 missions over Germany, studied his route maps with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. Wilson had developed an almost mystical ability to find targets in conditions where electronic navigation aids failed and visual landmarks were obscured by weather or battle damage. His role in Thunderclap would be crucial, as formations that lost their way would become isolated targets for German fighters operating with local numerical superiority. Wilson's maps showed a route that avoided major German population centers and known flak concentrations while following terrain features that would provide navigation references for crews operating under radio silence. Rivers, forests, and industrial installations would serve as checkpoints that could be recognized from bombing altitudes without revealing the formation's destinations to German observers. The margin for error was minimal, with navigation mistakes potentially scattering the attack force and dooming isolated elements to destruction. Bomber pilots received briefings on flying techniques that differed dramatically from standard high-altitude procedures. The mission would require variations in altitude and airspeed designed to confuse German radar operators and complicate intercept calculations for fighter controllers. These variations demanded fuel management and engine handling that pushed aircraft systems closer to their operational limits while reducing safety margins that normally protected against mechanical failure. Captain Michael Foster, pilot of Liberty Bell, had flown 43 missions over Europe without losing a single crew member to enemy action. His reputation for bringing damaged aircraft home had made him a natural choice for a mission where individual formation commanders would need to make critical decisions without support from higher headquarters. Foster understood that Thunderclap would test not only his flying skills, but his judgment under conditions where mistakes would have consequences extending far beyond his own crew. The bombing procedures briefing revealed techniques that would require precision beyond anything previously attempted in combat conditions. Bombardiers would need to identify specific buildings within the Schweinfurt complex and deliver their ordnance with accuracy that would destroy targeted structures while leaving others intact. The mathematics of bomb trajectory calculation became crucial, as errors that could be acceptable in area bombing could mean mission failure when attacking precision industrial targets. Flight Lieutenant Patricia Morgan, one of the few women directly involved in mission planning, briefed bombardiers on recognition features that would allow target identification under combat conditions. Morgan had spent months analyzing reconnaissance photographs and architectural plans to identify distinctive features that would remain recognizable despite smoke, battle damage, and the stress of combat operations. Her briefings included backup identification methods for situations where primary targets might be obscured or destroyed by preceding attacks. The fighter escort briefings emphasized independence and aggressive action rather than the protective formations that characterized standard escort missions. Hunting pack leaders would need to locate and engage German interceptors while maintaining enough situational awareness to coordinate with other packs and avoid interfering with bomber operations. The tactical challenges were enormous, requiring split-second decisions based on incomplete information while operating at the extreme limits of aircraft performance. Major William Carter had volunteered for hunting pack leadership despite having more aerial victories than most entire squadrons. Carter's experience in North African campaigns had taught him the value of aggressive tactics and independent thinking in situations where traditional doctrine provided insufficient guidance. His role in Thunderclap would critically depend on Carter's ability to adapt his experience to the mission's unique challenges and lead his pilots in combat against dead-state German defenses.
Would involve leading other experienced pilots in operations that pushed beyond established procedures into uncharted tactical territory. The maintenance briefings revealed the mechanical challenges that would determine whether aircraft could complete the mission successfully. Extended range operations would stress engines and fuel systems beyond normal operational parameters. Weight distribution changes from additional fuel and equipment would affect aircraft handling characteristics in ways that could only be estimated rather than precisely calculated. Backup systems and emergency procedures would become crucial as safety margins diminished under the demands of unprecedented operational requirements. Technical Sergeant Maria Santos had supervised maintenance operations that kept aircraft flying under conditions that would have grounded civilian operations. Her experience maintaining aircraft in combat theaters where replacement parts were scarce and repair facilities primitive made her invaluable for a mission that would push mechanical systems to their absolute limits. Santos understood that technical failures during thunderclap could cascade into tactical disasters, affecting the entire operation. As the briefings concluded and aircrew members dispersed to their final preparations, the weight of what they were attempting settled over the bases like a physical presence. Men and women who had survived dozens of combat missions understood that thunderclap represented something entirely different from their previous experience. The mathematics of survival suggested that many of those preparing for takeoff would not return. Yet the strategic importance of the mission made such sacrifices not only necessary, but honorable. The final hours before takeoff took on an almost ritualistic quality, as aircrew members completed pre-flight inspections with unusual thoroughness and checked equipment with obsessive attention to detail. Ground crews worked with quiet efficiency, understanding that mechanical problems during takeoff or initial assembly could doom entire formations. Weather observers provided final updates on conditions over the target area, confirming that cloud cover and visibility would support mission requirements. In the Nissen huts that served as temporary chapels, chaplains of various faiths held services that drew larger attendance than usual. The prayers offered reflected not only personal concerns for survival, but broader hopes that the mission's success would shorten the war and reduce the total cost in human lives. The mathematics of sacrifice took on different meaning when calculated against the possibility of strategic victory that could prevent years of additional fighting. Colonel Harrison made final inspections of aircraft and crew preparations, knowing that once the formations departed English airspace, success would depend entirely on the training, equipment, and determination of the men and women he was sending into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. The responsibilities of command had never felt heavier than in these final hours before a mission that would either vindicate months of preparation or result in losses that could cripple Allied strategic bombing capabilities for the remainder of the war. The first engines roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, their thunder echoing across the flat Norfolk countryside as ground crews made final adjustments to aircraft that would soon carry their crews into the most heavily defended airspace in Nazi Germany. Flight Lieutenant Andrew Pemberton felt the familiar vibration of his B-24 Liberator, Defiant Lady, as her 4 Pratt & Whitney engines settled into the steady rhythm that had carried him through 32 previous missions over occupied Europe. Yet this morning felt different, charged with an electricity that made even veteran aircrew members speak in hushed tones as they completed their pre-flight routines. Across England and Scotland, similar scenes unfolded at a dozen airfields as the most ambitious daylight bombing mission in aviation history began its carefully choreographed sequence.
Choreographed launch sequence. At RAF Wendling, squadron leader Geoffrey Hartwell guided his Halifax bomber through engine start procedures while his crew conducted equipment checks with unusual thoroughness. Every man understood that mechanical failure during the long flight to Schweinfurt would leave his aircraft isolated and vulnerable to German fighters operating with overwhelming local superiority. The complexity of Thunderclap's launch sequence exceeded anything previously attempted in military aviation. Rather than the massive formations that characterized standard bombing missions, individual aircraft would depart at precisely calculated intervals from multiple bases, following routes that would prevent German radar operators from recognizing the scope of the approaching attack until too late to organize effective defensive responses. The mathematical precision required was staggering, with hundreds of variables affecting timing, navigation, and fuel consumption that could cascade into mission failure if not executed flawlessly. Navigation Officer Flight Lieutenant Charles Morrison stood beside the runway at RAF Snetterton, watching as the first bomber disappeared into the gray October sky. Morrison had spent weeks calculating the fuel consumption rates and timing sequences that would allow formations departing from different bases to arrive over Schweinfurt within the narrow window that tactical coordination required. His mathematics suggested the mission was theoretically possible, yet the margin for error was so small that unexpected weather conditions or mechanical problems could scatter the attack force across hundreds of miles of German territory. The weather over England remained marginal as subsequent waves of aircraft lifted off into skies that promised either concealment or disaster depending on conditions over the target area. Meteorologist Captain Helen Walsh had provided cautiously optimistic forecasts based on atmospheric pressure readings and cloud formation analysis, yet everyone understood that European weather systems could change with devastating speed. Cloud cover that provided concealment during the approach phase could prevent accurate bombing over the target, while clear skies that allowed precise bomb delivery would also expose the formations to the full fury of German defensive fire. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.